In the early morning hours of September 29th, 2007, a call came across the scanner that a Revere police officer was down. City's first responders scrambled to get to the fallen officer and administer first aid, but it was too late and he passed away later that day at hospital. When the headlines in the next few days claimed that a member of one of the country's most dangerous street organizations was responsible for the fate of Officer Danny Talbot, the community was outraged. Many street crews like this particular one, among many others, had begun to call the streets of many Massachusetts communities their home in the last few decades, to the dismay of many residents. But this case was not quite as simple as the headlines had originally inferred. In fact, the night that Officer Danny Talbot unfortunately met his demise would become one of the murkiest, complicated, and somewhat embarrassing situations for the city of Revere, Mass. And its police department for years to come. What's up, everyone? Welcome back. So today we have what will most likely be one of my more controversial videos I've made in quite a while, and that's simply because of the emotions of Officer Danny Talbot's family and friends in the Revere, Massachusetts Police Department. I hope I don't get demonetized again, but anyways, it's one of the crazier stories from my general area in the past few decades to take place. And even though it did take place almost 2 decades ago in 2007, just a few years ago, the young man who took Officer Talbot's life, Robert Icavello, walked free after about 14 years in prison on somewhat of a technicality, some people say. The judge in his original trial did not instruct the jury on the self-defense clause, so Robert Icavello, originally sentenced to second-degree charge that carried a life sentence with eligibility for parole after 15 years served, now pled out to a lesser charge and was released, incensing the Talbot family and many others. The state admitted they were not satisfied with the 14-year sentence, but the case would be too complicated to try again after all these years. The odds of securing another guilty verdict seemed too unsure to put the family and the city of Revere through the pain of reliving it again. So let's take a look at this murky, disturbing case that resulted in an off-duty Revere police officer losing his life far too soon. I'm sure almost everyone from the North Shore that's of a certain age will remember when this happened. Before we get into greater detail, let me give you a general scenario to refresh your memory if you don't remember, or if you weren't around back then. Around 1 a.m. or so, a lone teenager who would end up being identified as 17-year-old Derek Lled, dressed in red, cut through a path going behind Revere High School where the baseball field was located. There was a path that stretched from the parking lot behind the school, through the field, past some bleachers, and onto American Legion Highway. As Derek passed the bleachers, there was a small group of people drinking there. All the people were dressed in civilian clothing, and in the dark, most likely it was hard to distinguish actual faces. But as Lled passed, some disparaging remarks were made by the group towards him. They were commenting on the teenager's swagger and loudly taunted the teen about his street affiliations. When Lled responded back, telling them yeah, he was down, someone in the crowd said the phrase, BK, but he said the long version, which I'm afraid to say because of YouTube's ad guidelines and the nature of this video. This prompted the teen to contact his friends. Being outnumbered, he probably worried what he would do if the other crew came after him. He called his friend Johnny Hang and told him what was going on. Johnny thought they were a rival crew from Northgate, and he told him to stay tight, that they would be there soon. But unfortunately for Johnny, he was wrong. The rival crew was not from Northgate. They were off-duty Revere police officers. So let me give you a little bit of a backdrop for the story and explain why perhaps there was a little bit of a tense atmosphere between guys dressed in red and their perceived rivals, or why off-duty members of the Revere Police Department would be making comments like that towards a teenager in a park at night. In the first decade of the 2000s, there was a spike in violence in the inner city of Boston, and also in the cities directly north of Boston. Many of the street organizations that began to grow inside the Bay State communities in the 1990s exploded in the first decade of the 2000s on the North Shore. The city of Lynn, about 15 minutes north of Boston, was the epicenter for these street crews. Lynn was and is a very ethnically diverse city. It has a large Latino and Southeast Asian population, along with traditional white and African American communities. Many transplants to Lynn from California and other states brought their street affiliations with them, and they spread quickly throughout the city. Both red and blue sets popped up all over Lynn, red having sets like the original Bees and the Young Bees, mostly on the west side near Warren Park. The blue sets on the east side had the Avenue King C's back in the day, and you had mostly Asian ABZs, which are still around. Now one of the main sets is the LCG. These crews coexisted with Latin Kings, GDs, TRG, ASW, or Asian Streetwalkers. Now the Trinitarios are also a force because there's more Dominicans in the city. And you had homegrown crews like the Deuce Boys, which were legendary. The streets and county jails were becoming flooded with new members every single day. While Lynn was the epicenter of this activity, it was quickly spreading to the surrounding communities as well. The historically Italian LCN stronghold of Revere, Mass. Sat right between Lynn and another dangerous crime-infested city of Chelsea, Massachusetts. In the 1990s, like many Massachusetts cities, Revere saw a large influx of Southeast Asian families moving into the city. Most of these families were originally from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, and had fled their countries years before seeking a better and more stable life for their children. The vast majority were honest, hard-working, law-abiding citizens, but a small amount of younger adolescents had developed street affiliations along the way. Shirley Ave, down by Revere Beach, which once upon a time was known for Italian hoods and Jewish Shylocks, was now home for an ever-growing number of various crews, mostly of Southeast Asian heritage. There were crews that rocked blue, and TRG, which sported a gray rag, had a heavy presence there as well, but soon a crew called BRD, or the Boston Red Dragons, became a dominant force in the area. Legend has it that TRG were known to bully many people in the area, and BRD basically took them on and ended up becoming the top dog in the area. BRD was cool with the neighboring red sets OB and YB in West Lynn, and quickly red became the fashionable color in the city of Revere. It was just like a wild time back then in Revere. I mean, I've been kind of wanting to redeem myself for that video I made about Shirley Ave a year ago. And if there's anybody that wants to reach out to me on social media and work anonymously, or if you want to be known, whatever, if you were around in Lynn or in Revere around this time period and you're in any BRD affiliations or Deuce Boys or AKC or YBOB, any of the stuff that was going on, I would love to redo that and revisit this. So I'm kind of doing it a little bit with this video because when I made that video last year, I knew the kid who was. I wanted to make the video so bad, but I knew the information he was giving me. I was like, I know I wasn't there, but I know that this isn't incorrect. But I just wanted to do it so bad. But so I'm redeeming myself a little bit with that, but because this video touches with that a little bit, but it's not really all about that. It's more about just the events that happened that night. I wish I was still in contact with. There was some kids I was in Middleton with in 2012. That were from Revere and actually knew these kids and were affiliated with the Red Guys and were part of that crew. Like this kid Black Ant, who I became kind of close with. I think he went to like Savio Prep or something. He was like a good kid. Good, like went to prep school, played chess and stuff. And ended up getting in trouble as when he got older. But we got kind of close that time in 2012, 2013 in Middleton. We were actually in the hole together, and I remember asking him about this because this was always a story that kind of like intrigued me. Like what really happened that night? Because the headlines made it sound like it was something, one thing, and then like when what actually happened was something quite different. And then that's what I try to do in these videos here is find out, somewhere in the middle what the actual truth of the matter is. Now, while many of the younger residents of Revere were being swept away by this new phenomenon and lifestyle, the city's older residents did not like it one bit. Many of the city's police department also had contempt for these street crews, which many of them viewed as one of the two words that you never use in jail, the dreaded word punks. Not my words, theirs. Now, while a lot of the younger people were just interested in living the lifestyle, having some fun, partying, and whatnot, some of the members of these crews were all in and willing to risk their lives for their set. Officer Danny Talbot was a Revere native who, by all accounts, loved his city. He was an Army veteran and a former goalie for the Revere High School hockey team. He and his fiancée Constance lived in the nearby city of Salem together with their Boston Terrier. Officer Talbot worked in a special unit in the Revere Police Department that investigated these street crews, so he would have had intimate knowledge of what was transpiring as far as the emergence of these crews in Revere. One can only imagine that he didn't appreciate, at the very least, the trouble that BRD, TRG, among other sets were causing in the city, and how it was kind of changing the fabric of the city as well. In my opinion, Revere, along with many other cities in the area, began to target these groups aggressively, causing an us versus them mentality between the young crews and authorities. Perhaps more of like a community-type outreach approach would have eased the hostilities a little bit, but who am I, Dr. Phil? What do I know? Most likely, Officer Danny Talbot had seen the young men he was about to encounter on that fateful September night before on his patrols or investigations, But in the dark, he most likely couldn't tell who they were, and the young men certainly couldn't tell who Talbot and his friends were at the time. Simply, when Lodi passed by, something about the young man triggered Talbot into remarking about his walk. Derek Lodi was a 17-year-old Revere native who was listed as homeless, most likely couch surfing at friends' houses, crashing where he could. The Boston Herald described him as a quote unquote throwaway teen. I know emotions were high when this first happened, but that's a prime example of why I really don't like the Boston Herald. They love to demean and dehumanize people. I mean, this was a 17-year-old homeless kid. But anyway, Lodi was just a hanger on. He wasn't a full fledged member of the Red Squad. He and his friends James Hang, Thomas Papandreou, and Robert Icavello called their crew Broadway for the street, one of the city's main thoroughfares where they chilled. They all would rock red and affiliated with that side, but only James' older brother, Darareen, aka Johnny Hang, was an actual member. Because if you can remember when this first happened, all the headlines were saying a member of one of the nation's most notorious street organizations unalived a Revere police officer. It's good headlines, anyways. But I don't think anyone on either side of this tragedy saw things escalating as quickly as they did when Talbot made those initial remarks to Derek Lodi. I almost originally forgot to mention when I was writing the script another element to add to the emotions and to the courtroom theatrics. Derek Lodi's attorney ended up being J.W. Carney, who's probably most well known for representing Whitey when he was captured in California and brought back. But he's the type of guy who loves to take on these high profile cases where the defendants seem like they're like the underdog and they're, you know, he's gonna help them out, and you know he's the type of person who loves pitting people against each other and playing on the dramatic. So that didn't help at all with his theatrics in the courtroom. When reports first came out that a police officer was unalived by a member of a reputed street organization, the public was mortified and outraged. But as more details about the chaotic situation were released, more and more questions arose. Officer Talbot wasn't in uniform and on duty performing an arrest. He was off duty in plain clothes, hanging out in a baseball field at 1 a.m. with a group of friends who, most of them all happened to be police officers as well from Revere. So quickly, the scenario of a hardened criminal from a notorious street organization taking out a uniformed duty officer was dismissed. So then, what did happen on that fateful night? Now let's do our best to recreate the events of that day and evening leading up to the altercation that ultimately caused Officer Danny Talbot to tragically lose his life. After an afternoon of firearm certification exercises for the Revere Police Department on September 28, 2007, Officer Danny Talbot, along with Officer William Soto and Sergeant Evan Franklin, decided to have a couple cold ones and talk about the glory days. Eventually, as the drinking continued, the trio decided to head to a bar slash restaurant, Margaritas, which, like, so randomly, like, beyond random. The day after I was researching this, I happened to be taking the train with my older daughter to go watch a Harvard hockey game. Thank you for whoever gave me the tickets for that. And I just so happened to look out the window passing through Revere, and I saw Margaritas. Like right there. Looking out the window, there was Margaritas. While I was researching this, I couldn't place Margaritas in my memory, but there it was, right out the window as I was looking. It was kind of a weird omen. I was like, damn, man, that's weird. At Margaritas, Talbot, Soto, and Evans met up with other fellow Revere police officers who had been drinking there, including fellow officer Stacy Bruzzese. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. All these darn Italian last names, I always butcher them and people destroy me in the comments. Even though I'm from a city that's like half full of Sicilians, you think I'd be better at it. But anyways, then before closing time around 11:45, Talbot's fiancee Constance and a friend of hers had been drinking at another establishment, joined Talbot and his fellow officers at Margaritas. These kinds of social gatherings among officers at local Revere bars seem somewhat commonplace. Now I understand that this is their hometown, and just like every other resident of Revere, they should be able to go out and enjoy dinner and a couple drinks in their hometown. But when you're a police officer or an elected official, you consciously have made a decision to take a position that separates you from, let's say, the quote unquote regular residents of the city. In my opinion, if you're a cop, then maybe it's not the best choice to get hammered in a bar in the community that you work in, even if it is your hometown. I think it just invites a host of unwanted potential problems, but that's just my opinion. I remember I briefly stayed at my mom's house in Rockport like almost 10 years ago when my older daughter was a little baby and me and her mom weren't getting along. And some of Rockport's finest to be down at the Fish Shack and Dock Square tying one on, and I'd see them getting like a certain look in their eye, and I'd be like, all right, time to go. Because I always will be considered a nuisance in that seaside community for what I did as a teenager, even though I changed. I don't want to forget. But by the time Margaritas had closed, Talbot and his fellow officers had been drinking for almost 8 hours straight, and you know that's definitely enough time to get quite intoxicated. Officer Danny Talbot, along with his fiance and fellow officers Soto, Evans, and Bruzzese, decided to continue the party and went in Soto's pickup truck to Revere High School around 12:30 to 12:45. They then took a cooler of cold ones from Soto's pickup truck and went to the bleachers at the baseball field behind the school. About 20 minutes or so after they had gotten there, Derek Lodi entered the field through the parking lot where the truck was parked, following the path to American Legion Highway, which led Lodi right by the bleachers. Derek Lodi, along with his fellow Broadway homies, had been partying and drinking at a girl's house that night named Amanda McNeil. So, as you can imagine, by 1 a.m., almost everyone on both sides of this equation were both marginally to completely intoxicated. My assumption is Lodi, being 17 and alone at 1 a.m., might have been intimidated walking by a larger group, so he began to walk with more of a swagger, almost like a false sense of bravado to ward off any trouble from his unknown group that was there. Either way, it triggered the group of officers, most likely who had some sort of personal disdain for these street crews and the effects they were having on the Revere streets, to begin to insult Lodi. They said something to the degree at, "Look at this G. Well, yeah, he's a real G." And as Lodi walked by, he responded, "Yeah, a G, that's right." To which Talbot or someone in his group yelled, "BK!" Derek Lodi, who believed this group was another possible rival street crew, contacted his fellow Broadway cohorts to tell them what was transpiring. Using a cell phone direct connect feature, I'm guessing it was like Nextel or something similar to that based on the time period, Lodi stayed in contact with Johnny Hang the whole time until the backup came to the field. As Lodi was talking to Johnny, he could hear the men in the background yelling BK and other insults. He told Lodi to hang tight, that they would be there soon. Johnny figured that the other crew might be a rival crew from Northgate causing trouble. Side note, I was probably in the Northgate Mall parking lot shaving 80s the whole time this was taking place. But anyways, in the next half hour or so, Johnny plus Papa Andreo and Robert Bobby Icavello went back to Johnny's house to retrieve a Lex Luger out of a safe. James Hang, Johnny's brother, was asleep in another room and wasn't aware of what was transpiring at the time. They then left the house and headed for Revere High School, the whole time in contact with Lodi, making sure that the group was still there. Once they arrived at the school, they stayed back in the cut by the school in the dark and told Lodi to go and reinstigate with the group that had been drinking by the bleachers and try to draw them out towards them. Johnny claims that they nearly wanted to intimidate the group. They didn't come there to unalive anyone. So there's also a little factor I forgot to mention that would contribute to the Broadway guys feeling like bringing a piece to the field might be a necessary one. Once Talbot and crew had gotten to the field and continued on drinking, Stacy Bruzzese became cold, and being a gentleman, Officer Soto took off his sweatshirt and gave it to her. This exposed his police issued 40 cal 22 G lock. I'm hoping if I don't actually say the word, YouTube's not going to knock me. We'll see. You never know. So when Lodi walked by, he saw this and he told Johnny when he called him, "Yo, they got a hammer on him." So that, in my mind, kind of neutralizes the argument that the only reason they would bring a weapon down the field is to do harm, when most likely they brought it for protection or at least to even the score. Once they arrived, Lodi appeared back on the field walking towards Talbot and his friends, this time maybe a little more aggressive, knowing the cavalry was right around the corner. Apparently, the reemergence of Lodi pushed Talbot a little too far. His fellow officers tried to tell Talbot to let it go. Lodi told him, "Now you're going to see what's up." Talbot snapped at him to get the hell out of there. By this time, Icavello, Johnny, and Papa Andreo were visible to the officers in the parking lot, if only as shadows. Talbot and Soto began walking towards Lodi, telling him to get lost if he knew it was good for him. Lodi claims one of the two officers flashed a hammer, quote unquote, and his friends ran from the parking lot to his side. From there, everything went sideways. Obviously, there's like various conflicting reports. No one can definitively say which side fired first, but Papa Andreo claimed that he looked and he saw Robert Bobby Icavello draw the Lex Luger. At the same time, Officer Soto saw a flash, and he hadn't noticed until then that Officer Danny Talbot was by his side in a standard police firing stance. Simultaneously, he saw Talbot drop, whether it was before that round that struck Talbot or after. Icavello also squeezed a couple into the sky as well. He claims this was first because he was trying to scare Soto and Talbot, and he aimed at them in response to them blasting at himself. He didn't initially aim at them. That's his story. Soto took cover behind a nearby trash barrel and returned a few rounds, but in the darkness, the young man vanished. Officer Danny Talbot lay on the ground unresponsive. The quiet September early morning had quickly turned into utter chaos. While Soto watched in disbelief, his fellow officer lay on the ground while his fiancée Constance held his hand, sobbing uncontrollably as ambulances rushed to the scene. Nobody knew what was going on at first. Investigators weren't sure if Talbot had been struck by a fellow officer. All sidearms were taken in as evidence. Once ballistics came back that it was not a department issue round, investigators tried to figure out who was responsible. Can you imagine the horror of the Broadway crew when they found out in the hours that followed that it wasn't a member of the Northgate crew, but it was a Revere police officer? They must have known they were cooked. The public was initially outraged. A red rag wearing thug had taken out a Revere policeman. It was a horrible headline. But questions began to raise soon after. What were the cops doing behind the high school at 1 a.m. anyways? Were they on duty? Were they conducting an investigation or something? The Revere Police Department didn't really want to answer these questions either initially. Because even though one of their own had fallen and they were determined to catch whoever was responsible, the chief and other bigwigs in the department were pissed to say the least. This situation should have never happened, and they knew it. The officers shouldn't have been intoxicated on public property at 1 a.m., and they definitely should not have had their service weapons on them. Now, I commend the Revere Police Department. Honestly, usually police will do anything to protect their own, but the chief threw especially Sergeant Evan Williams under the bus for above all else what he called cowardly behavior. Unlike fellow officer Soto, who returned fire and rendered first aid, waiting for EMTs to arrive and stayed there unseen and answered questions for the investigators, Sergeant Franklin ran as fast and as far from the scene as he could, even jumping in a patrol car that was responding to the scene after flagging him down and making him drive him home, at least almost all the way home if he didn't drive him all the way home. He was just going to go to bed and try to pretend like nothing had just happened. The chief also ripped into him about leaving his service weapon unmonitored before, during, and after in Soto's pickup truck, in a letter that was soon after released to the public. I'm sure after learning the identity of the victims, the Broadway crew most likely went into a complete state of panic and tried to cover their tracks the best they could. They dismantled the piece and they had an affiliate 17-year-old Gia Nagy throw it in various storm drains throughout the city of Revere, all which the Revere Pd later recovered. The young, relatively inexperienced Broadway members quickly caved under the immense pressure put on them by the Revere Police, the State Police, and the Commonwealth's Attorney General's office. No matter what the circumstances are when an officer loses their life, you can guarantee every and any resource will be used in order to resolve the case, and quickly. Lodi was picked up along with James Hang, who was originally charged with being an accessory after the fact, even though he was asleep when they originally went and got the piece out of the safe in his house. Papa Andrea was picked up a couple days later and recorded a statement describing the events, where he says his friend Robert Icavello was acting in self-defense and the other group actually attacked them first. Investigators concluded that Lodi and Johnny Hang were the main instigators on the Broadway side, setting the events in motion, but it was Robert Icavello who was the one who happened to be holding the piece and took Officer Danny Talbot's life. Feeling the immense pressure and the magnitude of such a high-profile case, I'm sure the young men were very overwhelmed. Now, I've read comments and different chats and said, too, that some of these statements might have been forced or, I've read some crazy stuff, but I'm just saying that. I'm not saying that's true or not. I'm just saying that that's stuff I've read, so I'm just bringing it to light and trying to tell all sides of the story. Derek Lodi was sentenced to 8 to 12 years for his role, while Robert Icavello received a life sentence with eligibility of parole after 15 years being served. This ugly chapter in Revere's history was all but forgotten when a few years ago it came out that Robert Icavello was granted an appeal on his second-degree conviction in 2016 after being denied in 2014. Apparently, the original judge never instructed the jury about self-defense. And seeing that the circumstances of the case, a group of men in the dark, which I forgot to mention in my retelling of the story, at no point in time did anyone in that group ever identify themselves as police or cops. And with their weapons visible on their hips, one thing they did say was BK, among other threats, to an affiliate of a street crew. It's a murky situation to say the least. In an unbiased view, we can say that it's completely realistic that Bobby Iacovello and his friends showed up that night thinking they were facing a rival crew, and certainly not off-duty Revere police. And then, unfortunately, weapons got involved. He very well may have thought that his life was in danger. It was muddy enough water that after more than a decade, Suffolk County Assistant District Attorney Edmund Zabin didn't want to retry the case again and put the Revere PD through that kind of embarrassment. ADA Zabin was at the scene of the crime that night and happened investigating the scene in the aftermath, so he was quite familiar with the case. Talbot's family was livid that Iacovello would be walking after such a short amount of time served. Defense attorney Jonathan Shapiro said Iacovello had been a model inmate while in prison, and he wished to put this whole situation behind him along with everyone else involved. Everyone else except Officer Danny Talbot, Judge Jeffrey Locke pointed out to the attorney. Like I said when I started this video, it's definitely one of the more controversial topics I've covered in a while. I've been going kind of easy since I restarted my videos a couple months ago, but I felt like I wanted something a little juicy to sink my teeth in, so this one had a little bit of an edge to it. While researching, I found all types of crazy stories and accusations. Some might be true, some might not be. And of course, much of them probably live in the gray area somewhere between truth and fiction. Either way, it is one of the craziest stories from that hectic period on the North Shore streets. And if you're around the early 2000s, you remember that was a pretty hectic period. Danny Talbot's family and many members of the Revere and other police departments still feel the pain as if the whole thing happened just the other day. Robert Iacovello, who by all accounts did his time and has reformed into a productive citizen, was hired by a group called Communities for Restorative Justice, or known simply as C4RJ. Their goal is to give children a second chance in life and making them understand how to make the right decisions in the future. Hey, that sounds kind of similar to what I say at the end of my videos about choices and decisions, doesn't it? C4RJ obviously thought Iacovello's story would be powerful to the adolescents they work with because one bad decision he made ended up in Officer Talbot losing his life and Iacovello almost spending the majority of his life in prison. But old wounds heal slow, and the Winthrop police chief, whose city has worked with C4RJ in the past, was appalled that they would hire Iacovello, who they view as someone who rubbed out one of their own, which is an unforgivable act. They said they would not work with C4RJ as long as Robert Iacovello was employed by them. Revere, East Boston, and Winthrop all are neighboring cities almost on their own little peninsula. It's like their own little world over there. It just goes to show that while some people see what happened on September 29, 2007 as an avoidable tragedy that they wish that they could move on from, others will never let go of the grudge they hold towards the man that ended Danny Talbot's life.